Hi guys, so we're going to be talking about what is on your exam today. So I'm going to just start right off the bat with free response. There's actually only 4 free response questions, but obviously there's multiple parts. The first free response question is sort of like from chapter 2 in your textbook. They're going to give you a normal distribution, and they're going to give you a normal distribution, and it's going to ask you what is the blank percentile. So you're going to have to figure out how to do that. And then it says, what is the proportion of the thing that you're talking about that is greater than 12 pounds, right? So you have to draw your normal distribution, find the area under the curve, norm CDF, good stuff like that. The second free response question comes from chapter 3 with the scatter plots and the 2 variable statistics. So they're going to give you a table of data, and you're going to explain this explanatory and response variable for the first part. Part B is to create a scatter plot on your calculator, so you have to remember how to plug your data in and get your scatter plot. And then it says to describe it. Luckily it gives you DOFs, so direction, form, strength, and then outliers if you want to talk about it. When you draw your scatter plot, label your axes and then make sure you describe using context. And then part C is saying get the equation of the least squares regression line. So remember, you have to do your stat and then calc your least squares regression. It looks like y equals like ax plus b or whatever. And then part D asks you if you were to plug in this extra point into your situation, what would happen to the correlation and what would happen to the slope of your least squares regression line. So you have 2 options. You can just estimate and say what would happen, or you could actually just plug the extra data point in and recalculate your equation and then see what happens. And then part E asks you, all right, can we use this line to predict somebody who's 8 feet tall, for example? So you have to talk about that as well. And then problem number 3 for free response is going to be all about probability. This question is a tricky one. So you actually did this, so I believe in chapter 5, where it asks you to start by either sketching a Venn diagram or making a table. Please, 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 please do the table. So it says the probability that, for example, the probability somebody in our class is male is 20%. The probability that that person is male and is a junior is, let's say, 5%. And then the probability that the person is both, So it'll give you probabilities, but remember, some of them might be the totals in the table, and some of them might be the stuff on the inside of the table. So please, 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 if it's 2 events overlapping, remember that's where you would have like apples and oranges at the same time, right? So it would be on the inside. But if it said just apples, that would be the total for apples. So you're going to have to be able to work your way backwards in the table. Please make the table. The Venn diagram messed a lot of you up in chapter 5. And then once you have that table done, or your Venn diagram, but please make the table. Once you have that table drawn out, it'll ask you an OR probability. So remember, that's where you add the pieces, subtract the overlap. Then there will be an OR probability that involves like A or not B, so the complement of the second event. And then you have an AND probability for part 3, so remember AND is an overlap, so if you have the table, that should show up pretty quick. And then part 4 is a conditional probability, so it'll say like the probability of A given B. Remember, when you're doing probability free response questions, I need that probability notation, so P parentheses what's your event equals, and then make sure you show your work and get your answer. Finally, the 4th free response question is from chapter 6. You're going to be given a probability distribution. You should find the mean of that probability distribution, which we actually just did on your chapter 6 test. You have to interpret the mean there as well on part A. For part B, you're going to find and interpret the standard deviation, so just like in the chapter 6 test. And then part C is a transformation of that data. So what do you do with the mean and the standard deviation for transformations? Remember, transformations, the mean always, you can stretch out the mean and you can shift it around, right? But when you're talking about measures of spread, right, if you're going to shift things around, we're not changing how spread apart our stuff is. So standard deviation, when you add or subtract, doesn't change, but when you multiply, it's going to either stretch or shrink. Okay, moving on to multiple choice, there's actually 22, not 20 questions. And it sort of goes in order by chapter. So when you're talking about distributions, and if you have a skew, remember mean always follows your skew. So you'll want to think about that. Question number 2 is about interpreting standard deviations. So make sure you know the proper definition. Question 3 is talking about when you have a 5-number summary. So remember you have your minimum, quartile 1, quartile 2, which is your median, quartile 3, and your maximum. Remember that between each two values, so between your minimum and quartile 1 is 25%, quartile 1 to median is 25%, and each section between two numbers is 25%. Sometimes it helps you to draw the box and whisker plot and do that as well. So then question number 4 gives you a situation where it's like, all right, I have 12 things and the average cost was $2, right? So far I spent $24, right? And it says, ooh, but Mrs. Hess saw some ice cream for $4, some Ben & Jerry's, so she decided to buy that too. What was the new average cost for the 13 items now? So you could find the total amount of money and then divide it by the new number of items, right? Question number 5 is eerily similar to one that you had to do on your review. It's talking about a probability, normal probability plot. So remember those normal probability plots, you're looking for linearity in your graph, and it should have no sort of curve to it, right? And then you have to decide if it's skewed left or skewed right if there is some sort of curve to it. Remember, if the spread out points are above 0, then it's probably going to be skewed right, and if it's below 0, it's going to be skewed left. Remember, my answer key was wrong. If you saw the comments where I put the answer keys, my answer key was wrong. Please fix that. Okay. Number 6 is all about a relative cumulative frequency graph, so an ogive that we talked about earlier this year. And it says, what is the interquartile range? So remember, you have to find 75%. You have to find 25%, those two values, and then subtract the two values. So one of the answers is going to be the two values at quartile 1 and quartile 3. But you want the difference between those two numbers, if that makes sense. Okay. Number 7 gives you a problem that has a normal distribution. It gives you a mean and standard deviation, and it says what percentage are bigger than X, right? So you can just use norm CDF. So you have normal distribution, and it's asking for a proportion greater than some amount, right? So that's normal distribution, norm, and then cumulative, so CDF. And then number 8 is another similar question. It says you have normality, but what would be between two values? So remember, you can use norm CDF, you just have to change those boundaries. Number 9 is a tricky one, but it's talking about scatter plots and trend lines and what is true and what is false. Remember that your correlation, it doesn't matter what X and Y are when it comes to your correlation. It does matter what X and Y are when it comes to your equation, though, right? So it would actually flip your slope. Your change in Y over change in X would flip. You changed X and Y. And then remember, scatter plots, you can't plot like a color. So it has to be quantitative. And then your least squares regression line, if you recall how to calculate them by hand, we used point slope form. You might want to look back and see what coordinate we used in that point slope form. Cough, cough. So then you'll have to pick out which ones are true. Number 10 is going to give you a residual plot. Residuals, remember, should have an equal scatter above and below the line in order for it to be linear. And if there's any sort of pattern to it, not linear. And then once you get to number, I think it's 11, sorry. Number 11, they give you a correlation and you have to decide if it's good or bad and if it makes sense and do a little interpretation of it. It's one of my favorite questions on the exam, which is fun. Number 12 is another question about correlation and what happens when you change units on something. So that might be something you want to look back at. Number 13 is all about what is the purpose of having a control group in an experiment. So you want to think about, there's a lot of good reasons or good effects from a control group, but what is the primary most important piece? And then number 14, it's going to give you a sampling problem, so you might want to just look back at chapter 4. There were some good multiple choice questions that had to do with the different types of sampling methods. So look back at those, that might be helpful. Number 15 is going to give you a situation, and you're going to have to decide what type of design they should use. And remember, if we haven't talked about the design, it's probably not the right answer, right? So make sure you're sticking to ones that are familiar to you. Number 16 is talking about what is the purpose of random assignment. So remember, that's when you have your sample and then you're randomly assigning them to a treatment, right? So what is the purpose of that randomization? And then once again, what is the primary purpose? So once again, the biggest primary purpose. So there's one good answer, but there's a clear best answer. Number 17 is talking about probability models. Remember, if it's a probability model, your probabilities need to add to 1, and then none of your probabilities can be like negative or bigger than 1. So you'll have to look and see which one is an appropriate probability model. Number 18 is going to talk about drawing marbles from a bag, right? And then it's without replacement. So like you'll have to think about, when I draw the first marble, what's the probability, and then multiply it by the second probability once that first marble's gone. Number 19 is talking about the probability of at least 1. So you might want to look through your chapter 5 textbook stuff where you had to calculate the probability that you get at least 1 of something. Remember, that's 1 minus the probability of getting none. And then one of my favorite questions, it was one of the more commonly missed ones that we had on our chapter 5 test. If you have 2 probabilities of 2 events and you have independence, right, we can actually calculate the probability of A or the probability of B. So we can do A plus B, and then we'd subtract the overlap. Remember, the overlap, when things are independent, there's an independence rule that you can use there. So you might want to check that out. Number 21 comes from chapter 6 that we most recently did, but it also has to do with chapter 2. It gives you normality and a mean and a standard deviation, and it's what's the probability that this x value is greater than a certain amount, right? So you'll have to use norm CDF and shade the appropriate way. And then number 22 is a probability model, and it's going to make you calculate a probability based on the model that they give you, which students did really well on last year, so I'm not too concerned about it. If you have any questions about what's on your cumulative test, let me know. And then I have all the answer keys posted to the reviews, so hopefully that's helpful for you guys too. All right, good luck.